By 1943, the Second World War had reached its climax, with massive battles happening all over the planet. In the middle of this chaos, Prime Minister John Curtin was attempting to win re-election for a second term in office against the coalition led by Country Party leader Arthur Fadden. Wait, slow down. What on earth is going on? Where's Robert Menzies? When did Labour become government? Why is a Country Party member leading the coalition? Okay, looks like I'll need to start this one from the beginning. World War II definitely brought out some of the strangest elections in Australian history. Let's begin our story from the last election in 1940. United Australia Party and coalition leader Robert Menzies had barely won government with the help of the two independent candidates Arthur Coles and Alexander Wilson. Knowing that his position in power was extremely flimsy, Menzies would attempt to temporarily end the political divide and form a national government with the Labour Party under John Curtin. Curtin, however, had just got the non-communist Labour members to join back into the party, and feared another split if he joined forces with Menzies, and thus would reject Menzies' offer. However, Curtin would still assist Menzies by sitting on the Advisory War Council. By 1941, mainland Europe had completely fallen to the fascists and Britain stood alone against the Axis powers. Menzies would travel to Egypt to visit Australian troops fighting in North Africa, and then on to Britain to work with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and other Dominion powers in fighting back the Axis. Upon arriving in London, Menzies would immediately find himself at odds with the British Prime Minister over the deployment of the Empire's forces. Churchill, fearing a full invasion of the British homelands, was attempting to move most of the Dominion's forces to the European theatres. Menzies, on the other hand, saw the rising power of the Japanese Empire and demanded that Britain move forces to their holdings in Singapore and Papua New Guinea to defend Australia. This argument would eventually lead to rumours that Menzies was seeking to start a political career in the United Kingdom and potentially replace Churchill as Prime Minister of Britain. Menzies was able to secure some support from the British for the defence of Australia, and would return home from the UK to a hero's welcome by the people. However, he would not receive such a warm welcome from his own party. Several members doubted Menzies' commitment to Australia, as he was still sending troops to assist the British in North Africa, as opposed to deploying them for home defence. In August, a motion for Menzies to return to London for more war meetings would fail after Labour rejected the motion, saying the situation was too critical for the Prime Minister to leave the country. Without the support of Labour and with barely any support in his own party, Menzies would resign as the Prime Minister. With no leader, the coalition quickly had to elect a new one. With no immediate candidates in the United Australia Party, the coalition would end up electing current Country Party leader Arthur Fadden, despite the Country Party being the junior partner of the coalition. Fadden was a Queenslander who had entered Parliament in 1938, after serving in the Queensland Parliament for the short-lived Country and Progressive National Party. When the 1930s punk star Archie Cameron was deposed as leader, Fadden would find himself elected as leader after a vote to elect the new leader was tied between previous leader Earl Page and future leader John McEwen, who we will see later on. Fadden's position was meant to be temporary, but after Menzies retired and Fadden was thrust into the role as Prime Minister, his position became much more permanent. Being the unlucky 13th Prime Minister of Australia, Fadden's time in the top job was going to be rough. Fadden knew his position was flimsy and he would not move into the Prime Minister's lodge after his predecessor, Cameron, crudely remarked that he would, quote, scarcely have enough time to wear a track from the back door to the house before you'll be out. And sure enough, just over a month later, in October, Fadden's government would be defeated when the two independent candidates, Arthur Coles and Alexander Wilson, disgusted by the coalition's treatment of Menzies, would cross the floor and vote with Labour against Fadden's budget. Fadden would then hand his resignation to the Governor-General, Lord Gowrie, claiming to be the Noah's flood of Prime Ministers as he had reigned for 40 days and 40 nights. At this point, Gowrie would have called for a new election, but with the threat of Japan at Australia's doorstep, he could not risk destabilising the country anymore. Luckily, Labour had enough members to govern as long as Coles and Wilson would support them. After getting assurance from the two that they would support Labour until the next election, Labour assumed office and John Curtin would become the 14th Prime Minister on the 7th of October 1941. He would be the only Prime Minister from Western Australia. Now, as per Labour tradition since 1914, Labour could not enter Parliament without a crisis happening, and that would come on the 8th of December when the Japanese Navy bombed the US fleet based in Pearl Harbor and subsequently launched invasions into the Dutch East Indies, as well as other Allied holdings in the Pacific. This put Australia's Pacific holdings, as well as Australia itself, right in the sights of Japanese expansion. Rubawa in the Bismarck Archipelago would be the first of Australia's Pacific holdings to fall, and it would then be used by the Japanese to launch bombing raids against the city of Darwin, where a large portion of the Australian Navy was based. Even though the Australian mainland was under attack, The event that would cause the most concern for Australia would occur on the 16th of February when British, Indian and Australian forces garrisoned at Singapore would capitulate to the Japanese after being overrun, in the worst defeat in the entire British Empire's history, with over 80,000 troops becoming prisoners of war. Realising that the British were not going to be able to protect Australia, Curtin would turn to the United States for help in a drastic realignment of foreign policy, which drew massive criticism from the British and some Australians. However, it brought attention to how dire Australia's situation was, as Japan began to occupy the surrounding Dutchies Indies, and moved ever closer to a full invasion of Australia. To cement an alliance with the US, Curtin would give control of the Australian forces to US General Douglas Macarthur to command the combined US-Australian forces in challenging the Japanese forces in the South Pacific. Macarthur had previously arrived in Australia after retreating from the Philippines upon its Japanese occupation, and would immediately begin to formulate a defensive strategy to protect Australia. His first major battle would come in May, when a Japanese carrier fleet entered the Coral Sea in an attempt to capture the city of Port Moresby, which would give Japan complete control of Papua New Guinea and leave Australia defenceless. In response, Macarthur would deploy his own carrier fleet to engage in the first major carrier battle in history, in which, despite heavy losses, Macarthur would successfully repel the Japanese forces. Australia's fortunes would improve when in June the Japanese faced a decisive defeat at Midway, and by February 1943, combined Allied forces had repelled Japanese forces out of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, although Rabaul remained in enemy hands. By mid-1943, tensions were low enough to have a scheduled election, and it would occur on the 21st of August. Curtin was riding an all-time high. Despite giving control of Australia's forces to an American general, Curtin had successfully seen off the invasion of Australia. Meanwhile at home, he began to implement large social welfare reforms which were proving to be very popular with the middle and working classes. The coalition for their part was still in an absolute wreck. Fadden remained leader of the coalition, but he was seen as a rather ineffective leader compared with Curtin. And the winner was John Curtin and the Labour Party, with their largest win in Australian history, picking up 17 seats to hold a whopping 49 seats, including every seat in Western and South Australia, bar Cameron, who barely managed to hold his South Australian seat of Barker by a mere 1.7% of the vote. The Labour Party also received its higher ever two-party preferred at 58.2%. The UAP Country Coalition was completely destroyed by this election, losing 13 seats to hold a measly 23 seats, which consisted of 14 United Australia members and 9 country members. For nearly its entire history, the United Australia Party was in government, and this election showed that it did not work at all well in opposition, and shortly after this election it began to collapse, with factions of the party forming their own parties or merging with others. Fun fact, this election was important as it saw Australia's first elected female minister in the form of Enid Lyons for the United Australia Party. She was the widowed wife of former Prime Minister Joseph Lyons. The election also saw Australia's first female senator as well, with the Labour Party's Dorothy Tangnay. For the first time since 1916, Labour had complete control of the government in both the upper and lower houses, and it would be up to Curtin to see the nation through the rest of World War II. Come back next time for the election of 1946.